Pastor Eddie, why don't you start the meeting?
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. We want to thank you for joining us on tonight on behalf of the South LA Clergy for Accountability, SCLC, and Empowerment Congress, and CD10 Voices. For this, what promises to be a riveting discussion, a much needed conversation around charter reform in the city of Los Angeles. I'm Reverend Eddie Anderson, and I'm joined by Harry McElroy from the Empowerment Congress. And we want to make sure we want to highlight those who have been putting in the work to bring this conversation to us tonight. We want to thank the councilman for graciously offering his time, for being with us for this conversation. We want to thank Pastor Norman Johnson, the chair of South LA Clergy for Public Accountability. We want to thank Sandy Hamilton. We want to thank Pastor William Smart, Bishop Byron Smith, Gloria Davis, and all who have joined together behind the scenes to put this needed agenda. What we're going to do tonight, after we go through this brief call to order, we will have some time to hear from the councilman around what is going on with charter reform and seat expansion, and how are we holding people accountable in redistricting, independent redistricting commission. Then we will have some time of sharing our experience with the current process, and then we will open it up for all of you to take part in our conversation. Tonight's meeting, we will discuss the thoughts and elements of LA City Charter Reform, identify the standards for charter reform agenda, and identify elements of action of plan for the ad hoc committee, which is meeting right now at City Council, and we'll be hearing public comment this month and voting next month around what will be on the charter reform agenda. We want to remind you that standard Zoom etiquette, we've been on Zoom for a couple of years now, so we would just want to remind you to raise your hand to be recognized at the bottom of your screen. You just click reactions and then hit raise hand, and we will be able to recognize you. Use the chat box to also write your questions or put your comments. And just so you know that this meeting is being recorded on tonight so that we can share with all who registered after the meeting. At this time, I'll turn it over to Harry McElroy from the Empowerment Congress.
I think we're having some technical difficulty with Harry, as we have had with Pastor Johnson earlier this evening. So we're going to have to improvise. I apologize to you all for any inconvenience that this may create for you. However, I need to tell you that we are extraordinarily pleased to have as our special guest this evening, Councilman Marqueece Harris-Dawson, who serves as City Council President Pro Tem, and who has been involved in the efforts by the city and the ad hoc governance committee to advance important issues associated with the important issue of charter reform. And so at this time, I'd like to give Councilman Harris-Dawson a couple of minutes to share with us what is happening in the realm of charter reform, what issues the Ad Hoc Governance Committee has taken up, what issues perhaps should be taken up, his perspective on this whole process, what the timeline is for advancing ideas to the voters, and how we might be able to engage the process more. So with that as a way of introduction, Councilman Harris-Dawson, it's a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Good to see you, Vincent, and all the various men and women of the cloth and community leaders on this Zoom. Thank you all so much for having me and giving me a minute to talk about this very important issue that I think is as important an issue with regard to the future of African Americans and our place in this city, proper, the municipal government. I wanted to start, Vincent, if it's okay, breaking from what you gave me, to start with a little bit of history, just so there's context to the things I'll talk about. folks should know that in recent recorded history, I mean, going back really until the 80s, 70s and 80s, redistricting has been a big issue in the city of Los Angeles. Going back to, the 1972 redistricting, where that process was used or was going to be used to change the number of District 10, because they knew a young police officer named Tom Bradley was going to run for council. I'm sorry, this is 1962. Council was going to run for council, and in order to delay that vote or delay that race, they wanted to change the number of District 10 to an odd number, which would allow them to put an appointee in by the council and the mayor and stop the person who later became Mayor Bradley from running. So shenanigans associated with redistricting go way, way back, and they essentially have not stopped during the time since then. This go round was really, the controversies were a continuation of the last go round. Certainly, some of you we had direct contact about a conflict I was having with the council president and Council District 9 about assets. Council District 8, which I represent, is the only majority Black district in the city of Los Angeles, actually at any level of government. And assets have been taken away from that district in 2012. We're trying to get them back in 2022. Went through a bit of a scuffle, I think respectfully between Curran and I, Councilman Price and I, but it definitely got rough and tumble there at different points in time. There were other conflicts on the council over the maps, namely what would happen between districts 4 and 2. That is Councilmember Krikorian, who was terming out, and Councilmember Rahman, who was just starting, who wanted to form really a district around class interests and the so-called renters district. So that fight happened in the council. It was fairly contentious. I think left a lot of bad blood in the council. And as a result, lots of people introduced motions. So there was a motion introduced to expand the size of the council, or to at least study it. There was a motion introduced to change the redistricting to an independent redistricting system, and a host of other things in and around redistricting. Proposals got put forward. The previous council president, when those proposals were made, they essentially went in a file somewhere and didn't go anywhere. Then fast forward, the redistricting process happens. We vote on maps. And the maps are finally confirmed. It took, I think, 4 votes to confirm the map. It was like, what's this character? The Speaker of the House in McCarthy. It took almost as many votes to pass this map that we have as it took for him to get his speakership, because there just wasn't agreement on the council. In the middle of that process, we had the untimely suspension and sort of rushed rogue suspension of Ridley Thomas, the 3rd Black member of the council, or the 1st Black member of the council, depending on how you want to count it, which also, left a bad taste in everyone's mouth. Fast forward about a year from then, these recordings come out. We hear people talking in private, describing what they were doing in public, just a really rogue and sort of thuggish approach to redistricting, a use of brute force to get their way. That causes a shakeup in the city council. It's a new council president, and all of those motions that people put forward the year before were put into committee and put into consideration. Council president formed an ad hoc committee on governance reform, of which I'm a member, Heather Hutt's a member, Council District 10, Councilmember Park, of the 11th District, Councilmember Blumenfield of the San Fernando Valley, and is chaired by the Council President, Krikorian. And we asked the city staff to review what other cities have around the country and around the state, what possibilities there are for both 2 things, redistricting commission and council size. Folks know that LA City Council has one of the fewest number of council persons per resident of any city in the country. Each of us represent somewhere between 265 and 280,000 residents each. So each of our districts, my district, is a little smaller than the size of Detroit proper, as an example. That ad hoc committee process has been going on for several months now. We've heard a series of things. The idea is that they will get us a report and some options to vote on in late fall, early winter. So think, between Thanksgiving and New Year's Day, I'd say, or between Thanksgiving and King Day. There will be proposals before us to vote on that would have to go through that committee, probably go through a couple other committees, and then come to the full council. Whatever the full council votes, it would go on the ballot either for March or for November of next year. That depends. That depends on how quickly we get it out and how much back and forth there is with the city attorney. Few of the key issues: some people want a bigger city council. I think that's kind of the common sense opinion, that we should, more representation equal better representation is the assumption there. And second, that we ought to have a independent redistricting commission. That we will have a independent redistricting commission, I think there's a consensus on that. That the council gets bigger, and if it does get bigger, by how much, there is not a consensus on that at all. My opinion on both these things, and we're getting some outside help to get an analysis. I care about how it affects Black folks and how it affects places places like South LA, where we have serious population and political interest. The sort of third way of thinking, and I'm leaning towards this way of thinking, and probably one of the stronger advocates, is, to me, it doesn't make sense to cherry pick one or two of these issues. By one or two of these issues, I mean the redistricting commission and or council size, without looking at the charter as a whole. Because also, frankly, as we're experiencing now in the case of CD9, in the case of Kevin De Leon, in the case of Ridley Thomas, like when a person can be suspended, what discipline the council can use, under what circumstances, is there pay cut or not? All those issues are still up for consideration and up to interpretation. The charter is not clear on them. So I think those are things that we could resolve as well. For folks who know, I think some people on the call were a part of the process. Charter hasn't been reformed since 1999, so we're going on about 25 years. Were we to start a process now, I think a quarter century is a good amount of time to look at the charter. So that's kind of where we are. Largely, I think that we're more likely to get charter reform, where we open up the whole charter and we look at that, than we are to get definitely an increase in the size of the council, but maybe even redistricting reform by itself. And so those are the things that we're looking at. And again, I appreciate this conversation. We haven't been loud in this. Our community has not been loud in this process, but I think as the time gets closer, it'll be important for us to do that, and important for us to weigh in with an opinion. And frankly, it's not even one of those things where we need to have one opinion. We just need to have visibility on the matter. So with that, Mr. Harris, I'll close and take your lead on what happens next.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to Harry, who has rejoined us. But before I do so, I think it would be important for you to once again, just very, very briefly say what you think the process is going forward. I heard you say that between Thanksgiving and Martin Luther King Day, you believe the city council will entertain proposals for reform.
That is the goal of the chair.
And then the final amendments will be submitted for consideration by the council for a vote in the period from Martin Luther King's birthday through April?
No. I think the council will vote on something. So I don't know the second trigger, but there are two triggers. There's a trigger to get on the March ballot that you have to be done and cooked by then. And then there's a trigger to get on the November ballot, which is later. The November ballot, I think, is somewhere around April, May. I think to get on the March ballot, we got to get it in, we got to get it in early January. So I don't know. I mean, again, the goal of the chair is to get it there for the March ballot. I don't see a consensus forming quickly enough for that to happen.
And can you please, this is one question that popped up in the chat, and I promised, Harry, I'll turn it over to you. It says, can you explain how charter reform helps LA's Black population?
Well, charter reform helps LA's Black population in a couple ways. It lets us look at the entire charter. I was elected with two other Black people. They've both been indicted and on the brink of expulsion under questionable circumstances. So that question needs to be answered for us. We need to tie up this business of redress in terms of what happens when there are vacancies, who gets to decide who stays, how quickly a special election is held, all of those things. I think the more the council moves towards direct representation, the better off our community is. So that's just one example of how it can happen. Yeah, I'll give you another example. A really, really simple one is local hire, right? So the city now has a process that leans heavily on an exam, right? An exam that we already know is biased against Black people. It's civil service exam, biased against Black people. We can change that. We can change that to look at other things, to make other evaluations of what kind of workers people can be. So I see a question in the chat, how does direct representation matter? Again, when the council can intervene in our representation vis-a-vis a suspension, for example, we are at a distinct disadvantage. There's just no question. There's no other way to articulate that. I've sat there with a front row seat and watched it. The tighter that is, in other words, the more restraint there is on the council from interfering with the decisions that have been made by the voters, the better off we were. I'll give you an example. In Congress, George Santos has been demonstrated to the world to be a criminal, a fraud, and a con man. He still sits there and votes because the people of that district voted for him. I'm not arguing that's a good thing. What I'm arguing is the council cannot interfere. The Congress cannot interfere with an election that the people of that part of the state of New York had. So that's what I mean about the advantage we have with direct representation as opposed to representation through the body.
So with that, I'll ask Harry.
Okay, thank you. Sorry all for technical difficulties, but I'm back. So at this point, first of all, I'd like to thank Councilman Harris-Dawson for a very informative discussion. We like to open it up for your questions. So if you'd like to ask some questions of the councilman, we have about 10 to 15 minutes to do so. So please join in the discussion.
Harry, I think Gloria has a question. Gloria Davis.
Gloria. Okay, Gloria.
She's very
Gloria, can you unmute yourself?
Okay, I'm sorry. The host had me muted. My question is, what are some of the pros and cons of expanding the council?
All right, good question. The big pro of expanding the council is that there are really two. You get, each council office represents less people to answer to, less issues to be concerned with. As an example, I'll take my district as an example. I have both the western corner of Watts, which is one of the poorest communities anywhere in the country, and I have Baldwin Hills, which is one of the wealthiest Black communities anywhere in the country. So those are vastly different areas with vastly different interests. And so the argument is those neighborhoods perhaps should have different representatives on the council. That's the big advantage. The big disadvantage is each council member is less significant or influential. African Americans are in a place now where we have 3 out of 15 of the members of the council. It's almost 30% of the council. You know, our representation in the city is about 9%, and maybe 11 when you look at actual voter turnout. So more council districts, there's less opportunity for Black folks to influence the balance of power on the council.
The second part of my question is the budget. How will this impact the budget? Will there be more money allocated for these council districts, or it will be the same amount of money?
Well, the city will have the same amount of money. This won't increase the amount of money that the city has, but look, it doesn't make sense to expand the council and shrink the council offices, right? So I have, as an example, I have a staff of about 25 people to serve, you know, the 280,000 people in my district. If you cut my district in half and you cut my staff in half, well, it's a wash. It's about the same, right? In terms of per resources per neighborhood or per voter. If you keep the council offices the same and you increase the districts, then you get, you know, you can experience higher touch government, right? In terms of how quickly someone shows up, you know, like no matter how many people with the constituency as large as we have, no matter how many people I hire, you can't answer every call on the day it comes, or even a couple days within it comes. You shrink my district, theoretically that's possible, but again, I believe that's only a theory.
Well, thank you and congratulations, President Pro Tem.
Thank you so much.
Okay. If I can pull up a question out of the chat. We have a comment from Mr. Boris Ricks. Council expansion has the potential to create opportunities for underrepresented groups, particularly communities of color. Is there a comment you want to make about that?
Yeah, I mean, look, the expansion creates opportunities for folks who may not have opportunities now. So a big debate in every redistricting in the last, I don't know, call it 40 years has been Koreatown. Well, you know, Koreatown is now wholly in the 10th Council District, which is represented by an African-American and has been for some time. It took a lot to get that district to get Koreatown from being split amongst several districts into one. They've achieved that. You decrease the size, you increase the size of the council, decrease the size of the districts, then theoretically Koreatown could be decisive in an election. We don't know that, but that certainly is the theory. So that's a community of color that theoretically could benefit from more council districts.
Thank you. Next, let me call on Miss Joan Russell, I believe it is.
Joanne Russell.
Joanne Russell, I'm sorry. You can ask your question then.
Good evening, Councilman, and congratulations. My question is, considering how difficult it was to get people's attention around redistricting, what is our campaign and what is our strategy for starting to get the message out to the people early enough so that they become informed and can participate, because the turn of the year is not that far away?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. Redistricting is always a hard issue because if you're not very involved in the government, it's fairly confusing. You know, I've been on the council for one redistricting, and I was the chair of the African American Redistricting Commission before that, and active in redistricting, before that. And every time it's a struggle to get mass involvement or widespread involvement in the question. The fact that it will be on the ballot will help. Again, even if it's a low turnout election, having a sizable group from our community that's very engaged, I think can be very beneficial for us. And so, I think that gives us an opportunity, but it's a tough issue to get folks interested in, I will confess.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have a question from Brittany Daniel.
Hey, as a South Central native, excuse me, beyond expanding the council, how can you encourage like Black Angelinos of millennials, Gen Z to stay here when it's just so expensive? So I'm sorry.
Look, all we can do is produce more housing. I mean, I don't know any other answer to that. There's you can encourage people all you want. If they can't afford it, they can't afford it. And so, you know, I think both building, I think subsidies, I think, new household tax credits and a bunch of other things can be put in place. But, you know, we've got a long way to go because we're so far behind on housing in all parts of the city, not just ours, that it's going to be a while before the pricing settles out.
Next, we have a question from Bishop Byron Smith.
Yes, good evening, Pro Temp Councilman Harris. I want to, I'm Marqueece. I want to ask, I know we've been speaking about charter reform. We've talked about direct representation and council expansion. One of the questions that I have, especially examining some of the history over Los Angeles and the council, what parameters are being put in place to have some checks and balances that could have some transparency and some accountability as it relates to elected officials and how they're handled?
You know, that's a good question. That's something that we can only address through charter reform, frankly. The council does not have the legal authority to address that. You know, we have about 89 different standards for how people are treated. You know, I'll take you back in history. Some of you are old enough to remember a council member from the 1st District named Mike Hernandez got caught buying and using cocaine at a local address by LAPD. He took a leave of absence. He was not suspended at all. Fast forward, Richard Alarcon got indicted and convicted of fraud and election fraud. Again, not suspended at all. Jose Huizar, accused, not charged, not suspended. Eventually indicted, he's suspended and resigns immediately. Ridley Thomas, we all know what happened there. And then, you know, Councilman Curran Price. What's happening with Councilman Curran Price is a direct result of the hell many of you raised when this was happening in the MRT with Ridley Thomas, right? So now there's reticence on behalf of the council to just run and suspend somebody. The point that I'm trying to make, Reverend Smith, is the council is making it up as we go along because there are no set rules. And I believe strongly that we need set rules because depending on the political situation, you get different outcomes for different people. The other place I'll give an example where the charter is lacking. So you all know Mayor Garcetti was talked about as first a presidential candidate and then potentially an ambassador, both of which would have had him vacate the mayor's office early before his term was up. The charter's not clear what happens when there's a vacancy in the mayor's seat, because since 1848, the founding of the city of Los Angeles, we've never had a mayor vacate early. So the charter doesn't really contemplate it. No mayor has died in office. No mayor has left office before their time was up. Mm-hmm. So there are lots of things like that that are obvious now because we faced the situation that weren't obvious when the charter was being written the last time.
Okay,
Let's get last two questions from Suzette and LJ, and then we're going to move to some CD10 Voices testimony. Suzette, I think they have you on mute still. 1 second, sister. Can we unmute Suzette?
Oh, so sorry.
Yes.
Okay, I got it. Good evening, Councilman. It's good to see you. Hello, everyone. Hey, so speaking of Jose Huizar, you know, we had down here in downtown LA, as you know, I'm in Skid Row. we never really been completely, fully represented in the decade plus that I've lived down here. What are the chances of our district having a second person to represent our district? And the second question is I know at one point City Council was talking about creating a board, a committee of people with lived experience, such as myself, Reba Stevens, and so forth. What has happened to that? I know De Leon took part in, trying to really make that not happen, but what's the status of moving that forward and, potentially creating an avenue where people with lived experience of formerly homeless and so forth can bring more equity to the table? Thank you.
Both good questions. On the second count, I believe Mayor Bass either has started the process to bring back the commission with lived experience or is about to start that process. So I think that'll move forward. As you know now, Councilman De Leon doesn't have enough allies on the council to stop something like that, like he did before. And he doesn't have an alliance with the president of the council or the pro tem of the council. So I think ideas like that'll move forward. Who gets a second member? Who gets additional representation? This is exactly the problem with expanding the size of the council. You don't know any of that until after you do it. So, for me, for example, for me to be a strong supporter of expanded council seats, I need to know where the lines are going to be. Because if the lines favor us, that has one meaning for me. If they don't favor us, obviously I'm going to be opposed to it.
Okay. Next, we have a question from LJ Enix, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. Good evening. I am aware of conversations being had in the Valley and on the West Side of charter reform being as broad as possible. And being some of my former colleagues on the neighborhood councils, they want as much power as they can get. So I wanted to know, what is the temperature on the council for the charter reform being broad, as well as what is a study, is there a study being done in regards to council expansion? Because you represent 265 thousand people, whereas in the city of New York, their council people only represent something like 65. So whether it's doubling the council to where folks only represent 150 or going beyond that, there's such a variety of ways it could be expanded that would have different effects on representation. It would be hard for the community to really be able to get their mind wrapped around that. So what kind of studies are you guys planning on to provide that information? Thank you.
So thank you, Joy. This is, so some studies have already been done and they're available. They're in the council file. So they're basically the nature of the studies are, some think tanks have done studies like I think Rand did one, and then you can look at what has happened in other cities and what are the pros and cons of that. Here's one of the tricks, though, you pointed out. So if you say you want it bigger, then what's the right number, right? Is it 15 to 17? Is it 15 to 19? Is it 15 to 23? Is it 15 to 31? I haven't heard a clear answer on that. Then I say, let's look around the country and find the city that thinks they have the first perfect amount of representation. I would submit to you that almost somebody everywhere has a problem and either thinks it should be more or less. So I don't think there's a definitive answer to your question. Do you say, okay, another proposal is every time a seat gets to be 150,000 or more, you create a new seat. So then, 1 year you could have 15 seats, another year you could have 19, another year you could have 25, and it could decrease theoretically, depending on how the census goes. So there are a bunch of proposals out there. None of them have particularly strong advocates. On the neighborhood council side, I'm glad you raised that. Neighborhood councils is the one thing that the city of LA has that almost no one else has. My team member Maurice Johnson has put the council file link in the chat, so you can click on it and look at all the studies that have been done. So I think we can do a lot more with neighborhood councils, but again, charter reform is the way to do that. And again, there is no, I think the question was, does a charter open up a little or a lot? That is a binary question. If you open the charter, you're opening the whole charter. If you don't open it, you're not opening any of it, if that makes sense. The only way you can piecemeal the charter is through a charter amendment that goes to the ballot, which is what I think the original thought was behind these two questions, the size of the council and redistricting. But again, I think more and more, there's a conversation about opening the whole thing up. One thing folks should know, these meetings are public, but they're being held in small rooms. The mayor has actually called in experts, and she is holding meetings with council members to discuss the pros and cons of full charter reform. So there are 3 tomorrow with 3 different sets of council members, because we can't all be in the Brown Act doesn't let us all be in the same room at the same time without it being an official council meeting. But that'll be happening tomorrow, and I think we'll have a better picture about what, how, and who stands where with regard to charter reform.
Councilman, let me ask a quick final question. On behalf of the Empowerment Congress, how can we best intervene to impact?
Well, look, we have a hearing on Friday, I think it is, and then there'll be another hearing soon. I think this group ought to come up with an opinion or a set of opinions, put them in writing, and get them to the council, but also to get them in the press. And I think, we ought to go on a public education campaign where we're educating congregations, community organizations, wherever we can find ears. And then as a committee member, I can make sure this organization or this configuration has standing so that you actually get a hearing in the committee process.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. We appreciate your time on this. Okay, well, I'll turn it back over to Pastor Eddie.
Thank you, Councilman Harris-Dawson. We thank you for your insights. We want to share and go a little bit deeper this issue. And so I want to invite Mary Lee, one of the members of the Empowerment Congress and a well-known policy analyst who spoke up with the CD10 Voices when MRT was suspended, to say that we needed to have an open charter process. So would you give us your thoughts on an open process or a binary process and what your experience has been around charter reform?
Thank you so much, Pastor Eddie, and I appreciate the council member sitting with us and giving us some insight from his perspective. I just want to say that in addition to having been a plaintiff in the case that challenged the removal of Councilmember Ridley Thomas, I was a consultant to the committee that reformed the charter in the 90s. And actually, it was so contentious that there were 2 charter reform commissions, one elected and one appointed. The Ridley Thomas case, in my view, the one I was involved in, was really focused on voting rights, on the voting rights of those of us who lived in the district. And we saw the person that we had voted for removed with no input from us. And that is something that I think is emblematic of what happens often to communities. Voting rights, challenges, voting rights violations are not just being blocked at the ballot box and being told you have to pass a test in order to vote. It happens when your vote is reduced or made more difficult. And I think what the ultimate result of that is, unfortunately, a sort of mistrust and disinterest in the political system, because people feel disgusted. Well, what I say doesn't matter. They can just take it away anytime they want to. To say nothing of the fact that our district, as well as every other district in the city, is contending with real life problems every day of the week. And so just removing somebody summarily from their post without a policy that we knew anything about, and as you heard from the council member a moment ago, there really is, it's a very subjective process. So, you know, that's just in real time, an example of why not just the issue of voting rights and your vote and how a council member is removed or disciplined or treated in some way, but the entirety of how the city operates. This is an example that I think is really instrumental to this discussion that we're having today. So to try to answer your question, just real quickly, first and foremost, people need to realize that the charter is actually like a constitution for the city. It sets out all the rules, and it's boring, it's wonky. People don't really care about it. They don't know about it. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and efforts to change one little bit of it or one little topic of it are very, very cumbersome. And normally there isn't interest in it until something big blows up. In the 90s, the big issue was that the San Fernando Valley wanted to secede from the city of Los Angeles and create its own city. And so that created all this consternation, and people rushed to figure out how to appease the Valley's concern. And they realized that they'd have to open up the whole charter to address some of their issues. And at the time, a slew of other issues were addressed too. But it's not an instantaneous action. And so what I mean by that is people can lose interest. The electorate can lose interest. People who have a particular issue they want to see advanced, they get it in the charter, and then they don't necessarily monitor this moving forward. In the instance of this current crisis that we're in, there were certain things that happened, particularly the former president of the council's disregard of the redistricting maps, that spurred a lot of interest in how the charter runs. So that gives you two enormous questions. How do you deal with the council member who you need to either remove or has removed, and also perhaps the mayor, if that were to have happened with Garcetti? How do you address the question of redistricting? Who gets to make those decisions? There's a whole slew of other things that could come up in the charter. But what I think we need to recognize is we need to learn from what's happened in the past. As Councilmember Marqueece Harris-Dawson said a few minutes ago, there have been many, many instances in terms of using the charter or using the powers that are in the charter in a malicious way. That's certainly what Nury Martinez did. She took advantage of the fact that people weren't necessarily paying attention and tried to create an outcome that would move her agenda along, removing Ridley Thomas, disregarding the city map, the redistricting maps. When there's no transparency and you don't know what's going on, all kinds of things can happen, and a bad actor or a group of bad actors can get away with a lot of stuff. So I guess that's what I really want to impress upon people, that in some ways, a city operates in this way, and it might like it. It might like the fact that it doesn't have a lot of scrutiny and that people aren't paying attention. So if we can learn from that, and we can learn that having these discussions about charter reform open up the entirety of the rules, this rule book of the city, there are a lot of steps that can be made, a lot of progress that can be made. Just the process of revising or reforming the charter, amending the charter, that's a public process. It's not done by the council. It would have to be done by the electorate. And that alone gives us an opportunity to educate people, to inform people, to involve them. I think the idea of the Empowerment Congress, taking it apart, having some real discussions on these issues, and coming up with a list of the priorities and the preferences that we have, that makes perfect sense to me. It makes sense that we cover all the issues that people might be concerned about. And just to quickly detail a couple of those, it is about making the council bigger. That could be one of the charter reform provisions that we want to see. It could be about modifying term limits or whatever they were. We did that in the last charter reform process. It could be about strengthening the mayor's power. LA is a notorious weak mayor system, which means that a lot of the decisions get made by the council. And there may be an effort to try to rebalance that a little bit. The issue of the neighborhood councils and how much strength they have and what's their leadership and what's their budget, all of those things can be determined by the charter. And then back to this question of how are vacancies in the city council or the mayor's office or other elected offices treated. That's certainly not going to be a dead issue. That's going to happen again. That's just the way it goes. And we need to have a process for dealing with it that's objective, that doesn't get decided at the time we have somebody in front of us that we need to figure out what their circumstances would be. The police system, the way the police department operates, that's another issue that is governed by the charter. So again, I'll just leave it by saying it's hard to hold interest, but it's imperative that we do it. It sounds like an issue that people are concerned about now, but we need to keep that interest high because it's going to dictate how the city operates and ultimately quality of our lives for an awfully long time to come.
Thank you, Mary, for those insights and expanding the conversation. And thank you, Councilman Harris-Dawson, also for expanding the conversation. We know that one of the issues dear to the Empowerment Congress and CD10 Voices was around how do we replace a vacancy? We know that in the last 3 years, 7 out of 15 council folks have been either indicted or replaced or removed. And as Councilman said, they've kind of made it up. And actually, the South LA Clergy for Accountability came out of that. We had a meeting with Nuri Martinez, and we asked Nuri Martinez, how are you going to appoint the representative for CD10? And she said, it's my choice, you know, whatever I want to do. We said, we'll do a community meeting. She was like, I'm good. And so out of that came CD10 Voices and a framework for transparency and accountability and some standards that could be raised in charter reform beyond redistricting, beyond expansion of the council. So I want to invite in Vincent Harris to lift up some of those standards that was discussed at that time and over the last 2.5 years, really, around this issue.
Thank you, Pastor Eddie. I certainly do appreciate the opportunity to share a couple of observations and insights about the process. As many of you know, I have worked for and with former Councilmember Mark Ridley-Thomas. I'm also active in the Empowerment Congress and have observed over the course of the last 19 months or so, a real opportunity for Empowerment Congress activists and regular citizens to engage not only the governing branch of the city, but also, as many of you know, the judiciary, which is a different kind of conversation. But all of it is of the stuff of civic engagement and participation. And to the degree that we involve ourselves in the charter reform process, we inform ourselves about how the levers of government work and how we can use the levers of government to our advantage on terms that are most favorable to our interests, whatever they are. I think the suspension of Ridley-Thomas raised a number of critical questions that relate to philosophy of governance. What does a vote mean when the person for whom they voted can be removed from office without any semblance of due process? And in the case of criminal allegations, without the presumption of innocence. So the issue of disenfranchisement, due process, and presumption of innocence for elected officials who serve on the city council was raised by Ridley-Thomas's suspension. The second thing that was raised by his suspension is, once the seat was vacated, what would the process be for replacing him? what is this thing called a temporary appointment? And what are the requirements associated with determining the eligibility of the prospective appointee and the process by which that person takes office? Those were the two most fundamental questions: suspension and disenfranchisement on the one hand, and replacement through temporary appointment or election on the other. And over the course of that series of observations, of the litigation, of the letters, CD10 Voices advanced specific proposals in the form of a framework for transparency and accountability. And I know that Diane Robertson and Danny Tabor, who were involved in that process, are or were on this particular Zoom meeting. And I would encourage at some point us to engage them in a conversation about what they observed and what they tried to do. Bottom line is, we raised issues of transparency, accountability, and inclusiveness in the decision-making of Los Angeles governance. And we believe that those issues should set the standard by which we determine how the LA Charter is changed. Connected to that is the notion of advancing and defending voting rights and ensuring that the voting rights of all citizens are properly enforced. When Ridley Thomas was suspended, the voting rights of CD10 voters were violated. They were violated in part because, in pursuit of her agenda, Mary Martinez didn't even permit us to participate in who would be Ridley Thomas's replacement. She just arbitrarily created a system or process by which she made the appointment. And in that process, the person who was appointed became more accountable to the folks who voted for her than for CD10 voters, which then raises another question with regard to temporary appointments to vacant positions. And that is, what powers of incumbency should be granted to temporary appointees? And is that not a voting rights related issue ultimately? Then there are two additional standards by which we need to concern ourselves. And that is, how do we ensure this notion of equity, and particularly when it comes to the allocation of resources? That sounds a little bit like reparations, and maybe it is. But in the context of city governance, should we have a mechanism by which the city is able to enforce an equitable distribution and allocation of resources? Is there a way that we can administratively ensure that that happens? Is there a way for us to look at policy making and ask, well, what is the equity index associated with adoption of this proposal? Would it advance the issue of equity, or would it advance inequity? So those are just a few of the questions that came to mind as we began to dig more deeply into the questions of disenfranchisement, suspension, and temporary appointment. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Pastor Eddie. And I think our agenda calls for some discussion, questions, responses, etc.
Thank you, Vincent. And so this is the Empowerment Congress. We believe in democracy here. And so we want to open it up to some some questions. So you've heard from the councilman, you've heard from our policy analyst and Empowerment Congressmember Mary Lee, and you've heard from Vincent Harris. What questions are percolating for you as we think about charter reform? I'll state that on the city level, there are 3, maybe 4 major groups that are talking about charter reform. Fair Rep, LA, Common Cause, RLA, and the LA Governance report have been the main part of changing the conversation. So this conversation here is for us to have around what do we as the Department of Congress, what do we as SCLC, as CD10 Voices, as residents think about this, and how do we want to lean in on this conversation? Are there any questions or for a conversation? You can raise your hand and we'll. All right. Mr. Taper. The Honorable Mr. Taper, go ahead. We unmute. Let me unmute the Honorable Mr. Taper, please.
There we go. Yeah. I think you're unmuted now.
Oh, what's going on? He's unmuting himself back. Can we?
Yeah. Danny, I think you're unmuted now. Try
there
now.
We go. All right, thank you, Pastor Eddie. And I want to go back quickly to something Vincent shared just a few minutes ago. I think from what we heard from Councilman Harris-Dawson tonight about the need for this, or the opportunity for this organization to present a plan or plans that could be considered as part of the discussion, or should be considered as part of the discussion in charter reform. I think we need to start by sharing, Vincent, the proposals we put forward as part of the initial CD Voices that you referenced a few minutes ago, so that everyone at least has that as a beginning conversational framework. The challenge I think we have, and I think we're up to the challenge, is to structure a
I think we lost him. Is he?
Yeah, we lost Danny.
Danny, are you still there? Did he mute him? What's going on?
Like he disappeared, so.
Let's do this. Yeah, I'm still here. I just can't unmute myself.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Teddy. Sorry about that.
Clear. I was just simply saying that what I think we need to do is take what we put forward as a proposal initially, break it into some clear elements that we can discuss and enlarge upon those individual conversations, so that our plan is across the waterfront, that we're not only talking about the rights of the elected, but we're talking about the rights of the electorate, those of us who vote and participate in the process. I think that the two are distinguishable, certainly related, but need to be distinguishable, so that when we discuss charter reform in larger community conversation, we're clear that we're talking about the rights of voters and representation at the local level in the current configuration of the council, and in a future configuration of council, what happens to the representative, and how does that impact the voters, impact the neighborhoods, impact the stakeholders, such that there continues to be a continuous form of representation. That was what we were trying to get to: transparency, accountability, and the responsibility to listen to and to discuss with those in the neighborhoods that were affected in CD10 in this instance, so that we were clear that we were being heard, and more importantly, that what we were discussing represented our collective interests and could be then decided upon by the remaining members of the council. That when you read what Vincent just put in the chat, you'll see that we tried to be responsive to the greater need, and I think that's where our conversation needs to head.
Thank you, Danny. I want to call on Capri Maddox from Civil Rights and Human Division.
Yes, thank you so much, Pastor Eddie. Super grateful for the presentation, and Councilmember Marqueece Harris-Dawson, President Pro Tem, so proud of that new role. And I really wanted to say, and also want to acknowledge Commissioner Marion Lee, and we actually have a couple other commissioners from the Civil Rights Commission that are actually on this call. We have Commissioner Robertson and Commissioner Candy Lewis. But I wanted to get back to Vincent's comment regarding equity in the city of Los Angeles. And I was really just here as a participant to listen and to learn. But I want you to know that we actually have a survey that's going on right now. The Reparations Commission, led by Ambassador Michael Lawson and other leaders in Los Angeles, are doing a study right now on the Black experience in Los Angeles. And they talk about, the studies being done by CSUN, which discusses and asks for input on how inequities in housing, inequities in education, and even with voting rights and representation are being collected. And we're in a march to get 4,000 folks to participate in the study. So I'll drop it in the chat, but if you don't get to it now, you can always go to civilandhumanrights.lacity.org. I didn't want to make a plug for anything we were doing, but I do want to let you all know, while the time is right, that there is a study that is happening right now in this space, and it can lead to changes in government, and even, of course, ultimately reparations that may have been a result of slavery. I just came back from Ghana, so that experience of being at court where people were taken against their will is very, very real for not only me, but even for so many people in Africa that also were traumatized by the wrongs. But this is not only about reparations. It's about how Angelenos are treated, anywhere from police brutality on to how they're treated in education and with the other elected officials in town. So thank you so much for the space.
Thank you, and please drop that link so the Department of Congress can be a part of it. And like as Vincent said, I want to highlight that the charter is a place where we can, in effect, legislate equitable distribution of resources across LA City. Like, this is the opportunity. We don't have to just talk about independent redistricting, which we want to talk about, and expansion of city council, but there's other areas as we've talked about as well. Are there any other questions or thoughts that's percolated since you've heard this conversation? Gloria?
Yes, I think our call to action this evening should be around some of the comments that the council member made around a set of opinions and a public campaign. I think this is very important, and it's a lot of organizations. We have the Southern LA Clergy for Public Accountability. We have SCLC-SC. We have CD Voices, CD10 Voices, and we have the Empowerment Congress. And our mission is to educate, engage, and empower. And I think this is a great time for all us to come together and just create a campaign. I don't know whether there's any funds that we can receive regarding this, but I think this is a great opportunity for all of us to work together and make a difference in the city that we live in. And with this evening, we've had as many as 100 individuals on here, and I think we really need to move forward with this. And I'm inviting everybody to, if you haven't already joined the Empowerment Congress, and that's empowermentcongress.org. So go to our webpage. We hope to have more information up there, and hopefully we have a video, this video, so you can watch it later. But let's get involved. Everybody needs to get involved. It's time each one of us got involved.
Absolutely. Thank you, Gloria. We want to emphasize, join the Empowerment Congress. We're about doing the work. We're about organizing. When we organize ourselves, organized people can always move the change we need in our community. And I thought I saw Bishop Smith. Did he have his hand up as well? I thought I saw that hand up.
Yeah, he did. He did.
Yes, Pastor Eddie. I just want to keep in the forefront as we continue to talk about charter reform and the process, how important it is for us to really look at history, as Councilman Pro Temp Dawson spoke about earlier, and how we need to really be cognitive of the history and parameters that need to be put in place, so the inequities and disparities and the things that has happened in the past doesn't keep repeating itself as we talk about moving forward.
Absolutely, and a part of that is attending the meeting. So I want to just highlight again that the next ad hoc committee meeting is Monday, August 21st at 10 a.m. And then the next one, September the 18th at 10 a.m. And one of the issues that we talked about, that you heard Councilman Pro Tem talk about, was whether this makes the March ballot or the November ballot. And just to break that down a little bit, in the March ballot, you expect it to be a lower turnout because it's the primary, right? In the November ballot, we expect a larger turnout because it's presidential, it's a general election, and you will have a higher chance of getting the reforms passed. And so we should weigh in, right? Even if you have nothing else to say, call into those meetings to tell them that much, so that we can continue the conversation and be able to do the organizing work and the deep listening that we need to do in the community. If there are no other questions, I want to turn the meeting back over to Harry, who is of the ad hoc group for a charter reform for the Empowerment Congress, to bring us to a close.
Okay. Let me say that, as Danny Tabor said, we have done a lot of work prior to this meeting on this issue. And so if you really want to get involved, there is a mechanism. We have this working group, and it's going to be ongoing. So we encourage you to get involved with our working group as we continue to address this issue. I want to thank everybody for participating. Definitely want to thank the councilman for his participation. We definitely value your time. We value everybody else's time for participating. I think we had a very lively discussion, and I think the city will definitely take notice as we move forward. So with that, one other quick announcement. Yeah, in terms of getting involved, we have a homelessness committee, and Rhea wanted me to remind everybody that the homelessness committee meets tomorrow. So if you want to get involved with that, just go to the Empowerment Congress website and go to the events page, and you can RSVP and get information on that particular committee's work. With that, thank you everybody for your time, and we look forward to you guys joining in at our next meeting. Have a good evening.